Thank you, Stefan. Okay, we're now going to be joined on the stage by our esteemed panel. Please file along, esteemed panel. So we have Claire Bennie, John Boxall, Martyn Evans, and Andrew Pryke, in no particular order, guys, don't worry. So Claire Bennie is an architect and development consultant. She's now working with 2 pioneering organisations on mixed-use developments outside London. She was the development director at Peabody, leading an award-winning programme of new homes and promoting the procurement of SME architects. Thanks, Claire. For this discussion, Claire will talk to her expertise as a housing association client. John Boxall.
That's me.
I can walk because I have this mic. John is a partner at Jackson Coles, project managers and quantity surveyors, and John is a trusted advisor to a wealth of developers and architects on their building and development ambitions. And John will be speaking from his 30 years experience working as part of a great many design teams. And then we have Andrew Pryke, who's managing director at BAM. He has over 25 years experience of leading award-winning design projects gained during his time at James Sterling, Michael Wilford and Associates, and John McCaslin and Partners, and Capita Simmons. And Andrew leads BAM's UK digital strategy, including the whole life BIM solution and smart cities proposition. And Andrew brings to the panel the perspective of a contractor. And then we have Martyn Evans at the end there. Martyn runs Uncommon, which is a property development company. He's deputy chair of the London Festival of Architecture and founder of the Young Architects and Developers Alliance. Previously was the creative director at Cathedral Group and then UNI. And Martyn will speak from his experience as a developer client. And, of course, about how he's not allowed to go to bed until he's made the world a little bit better than when he got up. All right, and we're also joined by Stefan. So I'm just going to slightly distance myself from you experty types. So I've...
I didn't think you were going to put it up on the screen.
I didn't think it was going to be this big. Right, so I've asked everybody, and also our speakers later today, to prepare these network diagrams. So they're inspired by the kind of diagrams you saw in Stefan's presentation, whereby we see sort of the different parties and arrows connecting them to describe their relationships. And we've developed a little convention whereby pink arrows are information and green arrows are money. And everybody has produced lovely diagrams. And I thought about redrawing them, guys, but then it just, it felt wrong. It was like redrawing, no. I'll just keep it true to your voice. And yeah, they're brilliant. So thank you for that. Okay, so Martyn, this is what you drew.
Yep.
Okay, so we often hear about how architects have lost grounds to other consultants, right? People harp on about it all the time. But your diagram maybe suggests that this is true. I mean, what I was really taken by was the way that we've got all of these consultants kind of surrounding you. They've got you completely surrounded, vying for your attention and your payment and so on, and all of the green arrows sort of moving out from you as the client to all of these consultants, and the pink arrows going back, but also that the pink arrows are also all rushing in to the architect, which sort of suggests to me that there are, even though in some ways, the architect's role may have been dissipated into a number of different specialists, that coordination of that information is still resting with the architect. So let's just deal with this issue at the front. Is it, because it's such a common complaint, is it true that specialist consultants have reduced the architect's sort of scope on paper, their fee, but maybe not their workload?
It's a really good question. Hang on. So at the centre of that issue for me is that property developers, which is me in the middle there, don't know anything about anything. We're project managers. But developing a piece of property is an enormously complex and technical and complicated process. This diagram here I drew because I could have drawn a different diagram from any point in the process of developing a piece of property. Sure. This was really from a view of starting at the beginning and doing a planning application. So I say that property developers in the middle don't really know very much, and it's because it's so technical, and all of those people around there, and there are probably more, I probably missed some, are delivering very technical information into a complex process that ends up in a beautifully packaged planning application. But the architect, for me anyway, is right at the center of that process, because it's typically the architect who will develop the majority of the document that becomes the planning application. It might have other specialist reports attached to it or bolted into a folder, but the architect is, for me, the person who is most in control of the most of that product that ends up at the end of the process. And all that we're trying to do in creating that is solve problems. So how do you solve the problem of being able to create enough property on a piece of land? How do you solve the problem of then being able to afford to build it? How do you solve the problem of the neighbouring properties? How do you solve the problem of the acoustics, of the rights to light of the neighbouring properties? All of those things are things that I don't know anything about because I didn't go to college and learn how to do them. So I trust the professional consultants. I actually don't mind who I trust to do it, as long as somebody does it and that they know what they're doing and that when I put that information into the planning application, it's going to be right. I'd be really happy if there was just one person at the end of that, at the other side of the table, coordinating and understanding all that. There's no reason why that can't be an architect. And if that service is deeper and wider and more complex, there's no reason why that can't be more expensive, and because there's a budget for all that, and I don't actually mind where it gets spent, as long as it gets spent properly.
That's encouraging, thank you.
Yep. I'll just say one more thing. I think that there's too much of a disconnect between client and architect. I put architect as the biggest circle on there because for me it always is the biggest circle. It's the predominant partnership relationship in that diagram up there. But I think in the world of property development and architecture, there's a disconnect, too much of a disconnect. There's not enough trust between those two parties. And that lack of trust for me comes from a lack of mutual understanding, comes from a lack of understanding that starts very early in professional careers. Trainee architects don't learn enough about how the financing and the technical element of property development. Property development students definitely don't learn and understand about what architecture can do to add value to a scheme, which feels crazy to me, but I think it's true. And so, for me, what you can do, as I presume most of you architects, yes. I presume, so what you can do on one side of the table is just work hard to attempt to fix that problem. And that's about really, I mean, every property developer that I know just wants their problem solved. That's all property development is, a series of problems that have to be solved, or solutions have to be found in order to push a button to borrow £100 million to build some buildings. And I say, I don't mind who solves those problems. I'll trust anybody that comes to me and persuades me that they have the answer. And so I think it's up to you. I would say it's over to you on that.
Challenge leveled. Okay. So, Stefan, looking at this diagram, I know that you've seen it before, but it looks in some ways like a very complicated, painful, messy network that's maybe, quite overwhelming to be a part of. For the architects, certainly, but then also as architects sort of then looking to, okay, oh my God, this is my client's business model. How can I develop a better understanding of that so that I can then maybe sort of be that person that Martyn will trust? Looking at this in relation to the four models, talking it from the perspective of the client, what kind of model is this? Even though it's got all of these thousands of arrows, what are we sort of essentially looking at? And I suppose we should also draw our attention to, on the left-hand side, we have finance and customers, many versions on the left there that are also part of this chain.
So yes, it seems if we were to disentangle this like a series of solutions, you're acquiring all these services probably more or less sequentially for problems to be solved one after the other. And I'm glad there is one green arrow coming in, otherwise it would look very unsustainable. There's a lot of green arrows going out.
Okay. And it's just one more question for Martyn before we move to the next lovely business model diagram, is that how much, you've sort of mentioned that you've got customers various types there. How much is the problem that you're solving for them, how much of that is bespoke and how much of that is a kind of product? How much are we as architects serving you as a client who has another ultimate client that you're still trying to produce something bespoke for?
I was really interested to look at Stefan's 4 business models, because I sort of think I've drawn one of them without really knowing it, and which is the one where you're acting as a connector between...
That would be the multi-sided.
Okay, so when I say I don't mind who solves problems, I do, because obviously all of those people are very specialist in what they do. What I mean is I don't mind the route by which that expertise arrives at my door. And so the pink arrows, which one's the money? The green.
Green, yeah.
The pink arrows go both ways from the architect and the client, because sometimes the expertise comes via the architect because it's a subcontracted service. Sometimes it comes direct into client, and sometimes the payment might go direct from client to service provider, but the actual work comes via the architect in a slightly disconnected way. That feels a bit messy to me, and I think there's really an opportunity for that not to be so messy. And so that's where I think architect can provide direct services, direct architectural services, but also provide a kind of marketplace or a matching and managing service, bringing that expertise and filtering and providing an easy life, I suppose, for client. What did you ask me about the customers?
Standardized, or if the
Yeah,
products...
but you've provided me a really nice segue to go to Claire's second diagram now, so I'm just going to jump on that for a moment. Because, Claire, this diagram sort of is one potential solution to the problem that Martyn's been talking about, in a way that, you know, whereas Martyn is completely surrounded and being overwhelmed by all these consultants like a bunch of hungry zombies, your diagram kind of shows them neatly put into a pen where they belong. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, this is the framework kind of diagram. And obviously, one of the reasons that these frameworks have been set up is to answer this problem. Like, there's just too many points of contact, and a number of PQQs that we all read where they're saying, we want a single point of contact. Can you just organize this all for us? Does this work, or does this leave architects worse off? Or is this sort of, as a client, is this a good model for you?
Hi. Frameworks are just a necessary evil, and I'm sorry to call them that, but public procurement means that you can't just go out and choose the architect you like, as you all know, and go, can you just do this? And as a client, I think you've got a perfect ability to match the project you've got with somebody out there. So what you have to do is try and get the perfect basket of architects who are going to be able to do that for you. What some housing associations do is collect themselves a framework of 30 architects, 30 QSs, 30 M&E engineers or whatever. That's absolutely hopeless. There is no way they're going to be able to have enough work for them to be able to ring those people up and give them repeat business during a 4-year period. So my strategy was always to have as few architects as possible, and that's all about repeat business. And I just want to sort of segue on to something slightly different, which is I want you to imagine going back 150 years when Peabody, where I used to work, was starting, and imagine the interviews that might have happened with architects at that point. So, Mr. Derbyshire, he's the one that ended up working with Peabody. Do you understand what it is to make a 3% return on investment? Can you build us something quite long-term and robust, please, because we really value that? And do you understand low-income residents? And that's pretty much all they should or probably would have asked. And what those 3 things lead somebody like a Peabody to do then, and maybe ought to now for housing associations and local authorities, is to actually have a long-term relationship. So Henry Derbyshire, 150 years ago, would have said, yeah, I get all that, And they would have said, oh, great, okay, we're going to give you a 30-year contract. Can you imagine that? And that is how long he worked with them, and he must have designed, 25 estates. he got to understand their business down to the last brick, doorknob and coal delivery or whatever it is. And he refined those buildings so he met his clients' needs absolutely perfectly. And then I'd like you to imagine one last phone call, which is me 150 years later going, "Oh, Mr. Derbyshire, how are you? Oh, I've been dead for quite a long time. Oh, sorry about that. It's actually time to pay your bonus because your extra fee comes when you've actually delivered that really long-term product. Oh, your estates are still going. It's 150 years later. They've got the same windows, the same bricks, the same chimneys, etc. And people are still living in them, and they really work well. And it's a real shame that architects are not incentivized by or valued or rewarded for creating long-term buildings. And you'll all understand exactly why. And it's because it's impossible to ring you 150 years later and give you that bonus. But so much about how consultants are rewarded now is around instant value, but it's long-term value that counts. But you simply cannot manage and measure that in time. And I suppose what I'm coming around to saying is there a way of selling yourselves? Is there a way that you can talk to clients and persuade them and talk about that incredibly long-term value? If you're a housing association, what matters the most is, after 50, 60 years when all that capital's been paid back, you've got this incredible asset. If it's costing you a lot to run it, it's an absolute pain and your business is not sustainable. But if that thing is really simple, really solid, has got as few moving parts as possible, and it's really elegant, then the residents will be living in it and it will be costing you a lot less. So what's coming to the fore now, as I'm sure most of you know, is this long-term rental stream. And what's the most important quality that architects can bring to designing for those kind of clients is that ability to design something that costs less in the long term, not in the short term. Sorry, so I've gone off piste there. But frameworks are... the other thing to say about this diagram is, of course, you'll be procured by the housing association, the PRS developer, whatever it is, initially. But you will then go to the contractor. Almost inevitably, D&B is with us. And by the way, D&B is not an evil. It all depends on the perfect employer's agent and the perfect client running it well. But you do have to be, as you all know, totally credible, both to your initial HA client and to that contractor in order to get that perfect building at the end.
So this was the first diagram. And
this is all about the money, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go on, Maria.
Well, no, because I wanted to move on to talking about, that was really nice to say that, contractors are not evil. Contractors are not our enemy. But before I wanted to go on to your third slide, which was...
Sorry.
Claire gave me so many diagrams. Because that, I think, in some ways begins to address some of the concerns about, or it tries to address some of the concerns about sort of long-term value and so on. But I just don't want to skip over this one, because I think this one's really important in terms of us as architects understanding your business model. How do the financial and information flows work for you as a client?
Right. I mean, I'm sure most of you know how it works, and it's pretty simple, really. Housing associations borrow a lot of money very cheaply. That's what pays for the building, and then they pay that borrowing back. But they lessen that loan. Previously, they lessened it through getting a grant from government. Unbelievably, 90% of build cost used to be paid by grant. So there was only a little loan to pay back, and that's what enabled renters and lots of social renters to pay that loan back. Everything's changed. It then was about 50% of the cost, and now it's around 20%. So HAs are in this real bind where they have to actually sell a lot of property in order to lessen that loan. So those purchasers have come in and are a massive fact of life. And the real difficulty now for HAs is they now have to make a profit or make a surplus, in quotes, because they have to have a hedge against the risk of those sales going wrong. So they've just turned into a very ordinary development model in many ways. But the key to the HA is that lender. If the HA can't pay those lenders back in any given year, they're finished. So that their whole business model has got much more risky. I had another diagram which I didn't show, but which is about sort of how much the architect's fee is within the entire building cost, but how much value they can then create. What a lot of HAs do is try and minimize their consultant fees, but actually, make them a bit bigger, because the value the really good ones are able to create far outweighs the cost of that consultant. That's a very difficult sell, a really difficult sell in the marketplace. But of course, we're now going back to a long-term rented model again. There are PRS developers coming up, and local authorities and housing associations are actually wanting to get rid of that business of selling, if they can, depends how much they can borrow, and actually go back to market renting and renting at lots of different price points. So that whole business of, can you create them a really long-term product, which is not going to, the lift is not going to break every 8 years, which I can tell you is spectacularly expensive over time. That is going to come back into the equation again, I think.
So in this model where sort of the housing association or local authority developer client works with a contractor as their kind of key point of contact, this is kind of another way that perhaps architects are finding themselves further on the sort of away from the center of gravity of a development project.
This is, you'll all have been in this place where actually you're right at the end of quite a frustrating chain. A lot of housing associations and local authorities are now thinking we must save money, especially local authorities, and you can completely understand that. They're not thinking long term. They want that build cost to be as cheap as possible at the outset, perhaps the wrong mindset, but that is where they're at. And so they immediately go to the supply chain, i.e. the developer contractors that say, we can solve it all for you. We're a one-stop, one-point place where you can put all of your liability. And what they then do is get a project manager, and that project manager then manages you, and you're quite removed from your client, essentially. And the process by which the housing association or local authority goes and gets that developer can take 1 to 2 years. It's absolutely extraordinary. And you will be part of sort of feeding into that bid. And quite often a bid will be won by who's slapped the most money on the table. It's just real. That's just what it is. So your constant job when you're trying to make your developer win that piece of land from a local authority will not only be being exciting and so forth, it will actually be making sure that that bid is successful from a financial basis.
So, Stefan, the first diagrams that we've seen here, Martyn and Claire's first two, really sort of show, although they're complex, the essential business model is about providing a product or bespoke product sort of solution to another party, and sort of that varies a little depending on whether you're selling to an investor who is involved or whether you're selling to an individual who is sort of just coming along at the end of the process or whatever. But this diagram that then introduces a new central player, in a way, the contractor, does that start to look more like one of those triadic models, and are they starting to take advantage of that kind of magic that you were talking about bringing in these two customer groups and sort of keeping them apart? What can we learn from the way, because this obviously works for them, puts them in a position of power that maybe disenfranchises us, but what can we learn from them in terms of bringing in further customer groups?
I'd like to point out two things. One of this difference, is it a solution or is it a multi-sided, has to do with how we define the transaction. And I think what's beautiful what you brought in, Claire, is that the long-term perspective of if one transaction is really building an entire estate, then obviously you have a multi-sided situation. And the connection that is more complex and not a series of individual interactions. But that is a bit the definition of the transaction, and that I think is a point of learning, because the long-term value is a value, as you point out, and how do we sell this value? Because if the business model is about the customer interface, it's about making the customer understand that long-term value is actually valuable. And I'm not the one to say who needs to do that, but that needs to happen, because otherwise it's not going to be monetized. And then it will be a series of short transactions.
Okay, Andrew. Best diagram of the day, guys. Came from the contractor. What? Put us all to shame. But seriously. So, as a contractor, you've obviously positioned yourself in the center of your diagram, which is what I asked you to do. Thank you. And you've chosen this sort of two-stage tender model. But could you just walk us through what is it like to sit in the center and having all of these kind of different parties that you need to negotiate the concerns and needs with and sort of manage the budgets, but also the relationships and the information?
Okay, I mean, sorry, am I switched on? Yes? No. What's interesting about BAM is I find putting the contractor in the center very strange, because inevitably you put the client in, the client's always the center of everything. But anyway, putting the contractor there, even having anyone in the center now is slightly strange, because I think the edges of relationships are blurred and it becomes one team, and I think that's becoming interesting in a sense that you're almost getting to the stage where we will be very soon design, build, and operate. And I think Claire's point of the operation of a building is key, because it can be 10 times the cost of a capital cost of a building in the first place, and that's obviously where the government are looking for their 20% savings, if not 30% at the moment. So I think the idea of where we're going and where we're reaching, but anyway, just going through the diagram as such, and I tried to simplify it, but in a sense, when I started to simplify it, it becomes more complex, and trying to understand what models did working with it, but I'll try to open that up. Looking at, say, take a typical commercial project that we would do at King's Cross. A number of the buildings we've done at King's Cross as a contractor. The design team is there. Argent, like their star architects. The engineers, perhaps not so important, but they come along with them. So you might get the Chipperfields, Eyes and Morrison there, take something up to planning. And then what Argent have done, they don't go out to tender. They've got agreements with 3 contractors, and we're one of them. And what we negotiate, and it becomes almost in turn, almost like Claire's point, you have a framework of contractors, and you negotiate. You don't go out to tender with a small framework and say, come back with the best price. They're looking for best value. They know they've got the best people on board, they believe, who can deliver it and give them something else. So we come on board. Leading up the design team, most of the time, if King's Cross especially, would take on the project from planning stage and work that up to detailing everything and take it all the way through. What the client is looking for now, especially Argent, a lot of private developers are looking at not only just a product being the building, it's the data associated with that building, the assets attached to that, and that becomes quite an interesting point, because we're delving into the virtual world of what's really required. Is it a model with data assets attached to that? And that becomes very valuable in how to understand the capability and performance of a building. So inevitably, at the beginning, the relationship is 2 stages. Obviously, you get a management fee, in the prelims. You get a design fee from the design team, maybe from BAM Design, and you agree what are you trying to bring with contractors' proposals, and actually BIM, digital construction, is becoming more a part of that. Moving on, really, doing the pre-construction is the biggest risk in the whole stage of the project. If that goes wrong, the whole project goes wrong. So what we're trying to do with the design team is understand, evaluate, de-risk the project. What value can the design team bring to that? Inevitably, the design team do lead a lot of the project going forward. Lincoln University project, we unlocked a project that the client was looking 2 years to unlock. So therefore, the architect becomes the center of driving that forward. And therefore, that's what I say, the blurring of the edges. The contractor is relying on the architect to bring those solutions forward. Supply chain is an interesting one, because at the pre-construction stage, you're actually talking to the big 5 contracting packages, whether below groundworks, foundations, superstructure, facades, and MEP, and they're the key ones you want to de-risk. And some of those will have a design input, some won't have design input. You talk about material suppliers, and therefore the relationship becomes slightly interesting with FF&E, furniture. Inevitably, I think you go into a matchmaking situation where you go to a middle person, and they set up for different pieces of furniture for a price. And again, that's blurring because we're saying design, well, we don't need that. We can actually get involved, and that's actually putting a barrier between getting the right piece of furniture, the right tabletop with the right legs and everything else. So that's becoming an interesting model of how we're looking at that. The tenant or the user is obviously crucial to the building. If the building doesn't work functionally, socially, it fails. And therefore, we're getting much more involved in talking to tenants. And that's where I think the virtual world comes into it. And that's why I've always called the virtual product is a product. What we're doing at King's Cross is we've now developed a model for the whole of King's Cross, but particularly there's a project there, the Coal Drops project. We've been working with Heatherwicks, taking it through to planning and taking it up to construction, which is in at the moment. But there's 60 bespoke retail units in that. At the moment, they've got a physical model, the traditional sense, and they've got brochures. We've got a model now, and we're using, virtual reality and mixed reality to take potential tenants through there, understand they can walk the building, walk it through, and that becomes a product on its own. It's almost like a drawing that we used to produce at Sterling's. To produce a drawing, it's framed, put in the Royal Academy, and that almost becomes a product, and someone ends up buying it. So it's an interesting way
Put it on a mug.
that changes. So the user becomes much more involved, and the blurring of the edges, they come much more on board. Particularly important, which is the one always missed, and with criticism, what I say is I think the architect has a chance now. Digital construction as a designer, I think design is the utmost at the front of everything we do, and even the smart cities, Southampton, it was a design solution, not a digital technological solution that I came up with. But it's facility management. It's about operation and maintenance of the building. As I say, it can cost 10 times the cost of the capital cost. But what we're saying is the facilities manager gets on board on day one, ideally with the contractor, understands how that building's going to operate, what information is needed, sets the brief, and sets it all the way through. And obviously, practical completion, which is a strange term in its sense, either a building is complete or it's not complete. Therefore, it's practically complete. Well, the building's complete when it's being used and used properly and performing properly. So the operation and maintenance is key. So it's what information is needed for the facilities manager and the operation and maintenance teams to save. And our teams internally, we do our own property development, design, construction, facilities management, and we use our own buildings. So we understand in getting that feedback, and we're saving 50% on emergency call-outs and even pre-planned maintenance. So the comeback, the savings are there altogether. But really, I suppose, it's a two-way solutions process. It's feeding back continually, and then even after the building's finished, it's feeding back, and that's what government soft landings is looking at. It's not a way to legally sort of then sue you because your building's not working. Actually, the ideal behind it is try and feed back, and that's why the digital side comes back, asset tagging. You can start to relate, light fittings that fail. You can look at consequences across that and improve things. And the likes of the Edge building, the PLP building in Amsterdam, meant to be the smartest building in the world. It's all about feeding back information and the user experience and the efficiency of the people who are using that, the agile working of that. So in there, it feeds through. It's almost like a flower diagram. But what I was saying is everybody is working together. It's a blurred situation. We're operating in big rooms, having everybody, with schools projects, we've even got a client in the same room. From day one, everybody's working in the same space, working together, and it becomes a project-wide, almost a project experience and project-rewarded structure, which is an interesting way how things are going. So I'm slightly rambling on, but...
Okay. I think what all of these diagrams are illustrating, and this is John's as well, and there are an enormous number of relationships that we're all sort of concurrently managing. And I suppose something that I wanted to bring up with John, seeing as you've got a mic. This is your diagram. You've got the client in the middle there. You've got yourself up in the top right-hand corner, because you're very humble.
I'm trying to be humble. Yes.
But perhaps another myth, or maybe the myth that needs debunking, or maybe just something that needs clarifying, and perhaps it is in sort of response to these sort of growing complexities that everybody has sort of been describing. But we can see we've got the client, we've got the relationship between the client and the architect, which is not too dissimilar to the one that Martyn showed. We've got the project manager, and the relationship of the project manager to the client and the relationship of the architect to the client in terms of the sort of the pink and the green arrows looks pretty similar. And I suppose my question is, why has the project manager role become different to the one that is to the architect's role? Why has that sort of separated off? Has that really cost us? Is this something that we're supposed to be fighting against, or is that just an archaic kind of perspective that we should be moving forward from?
Well, firstly, can you hear me?
No.
No?
Yes.
Yes,
Hold
you
it close to
can.
your mouth.
Okay. I think the project manager, firstly, is not your enemy. I think I often sort of, when I say, oh yes, we do project management, there's a faint hiss, there's a boo. People see us as the enemy. I think if you look at the type of work that we do, we manage to provide a service which we feel allows design to come through. The historic aspect...
Just trying to kill the project manager. Sorry, don't worry. Carry on.
The historic aspect as to why the role has arisen, I'm no expert on. I think it just has. I think that's a bigger topic, and it's something to do with architectural education and other parts. I should say, I looked at this diagram before I came this morning and realised I'd missed out two very important pink lines, which were from the project manager to the client. There should be ones coming across there for anybody who spotted that. This is because I did this when I was on holiday. The other thing that I was struck by, there was one comment from Stefan, I think, talking about sequential solving of problems. Certainly in the project management that we do, it's not sequential, it is ongoing, it is continuous. Each of those pink arrows carries on the whole time. And I think also the putting in the contractor and subcontractor role was very important to me as well. I was trying to represent the whole thing rather than a particular point in the process, perhaps unlike Martyn. And also, I should stress we do QS work as well, so therefore the QS, it's a slightly different role. There's much more sort of interaction with particular team members in a very defined way. And less of trying to sort of shepherd the whole process along, which is much more where we are with project management. The other thing I think it's important to try and do with these things is simplify. There is a tendency to think that everything gets terribly complex, and actually it doesn't. It's about dealing with people, trying to make sure that everybody understands what they're supposed to be doing. Understanding that if you like, a scope of services for what everybody is doing, they need to understand, but also adding to that an aspiration to ensure that quality comes into that and quality is achieved in everything that is done. And again, we try and engender that in terms of what we do.
Okay, thank you. We're going to open the floor to questions in a moment, so be cooking some up. Just before we do that, Stefan, looking at the planning consultant in the middle at the left there, that role seems to be sort of a fairly simple solutions model relationship with the client. Do I understand that correctly?
Right.
Then looking at that and then comparing that with the architect or the project manager, there are many more pink arrows. It feels like you're kind of more of a fly just trapped in a web. Cows don't drink milk. But are we still talking about a solutions model in these typical sort of business models in terms of the architect's role?
Yeah, it seems definitely from the drawings that the complexity when we see a transaction as something long going and concurrent with a lot of relationships that are included in a transaction happening at the same time, we could see that as multi-sided. I would, however, argue that what is the actual transaction? So where is the compensation happening? Where is value created, and where is the bill actually sent out and some money coming back? So that's important for seeing this relationship, because otherwise we get in a kind of an endless ecosystem view where we cannot make sense anymore of where is the value being delivered that is worth that somebody is paying for that. But I agree, the complexity definitely suggests this is moving in a multi-sided space.
I suppose what I'm leading towards is wondering whether there is potential, given the context in which we're all working, and sort of as these guys have shown, to maybe change our model from a typical solutions model, but to start to develop some of these other relationships, some of these arrows, change the ecosystem in a way that maybe places the architect in a position of more power. So to go back to Martyn's point earlier, it's like, if I can speak to one person, I can trust them to do everything, that would be a godsend. It feels as though, you know, we do matchmaking, we bring people together all the time, but that's not really anything we ever get a cut from. And we do, you know, we do provide products for people. We do sort of have designs that already exist. There are lots of things that maybe have latent potential to sort of be exploited. The other models could be exploited.
The question would be, how do you, as we said before, how do you sell long-term value? How do you make sure if something actually works well, there is a bonus connected to this? And how do you get this out there?
Martyn, you sound like you want to say something.
Well, it's about understanding, that for me, speaking as a developer, all I'm doing all the time is managing risk. Mostly about money. Mostly about how to spend as little as possible at the highest risk time, and then being able to spend a little more as risk reduces, and it gets closer to the point at which that money's safe and is coming back. And so, for instance, so I just sat in a meeting talking about a tricky planning application, and having a conversation with a planning authority, telling them, almost throwing money at them to say, if you do this more efficiently and speed this process up, we will pay. And that's quite a big conversation at the minute about how you can, because planning departments and local authorities are being so gutted of resource, developers are very, very happy to pay quite large sums of money to planning authorities to speed up planning process, because that is the most high-risk point in a development project. And so that's a very simple transaction. You see value, you pay for it. And I don't understand why, no, that's wrong. I think there is opportunity for architects at the center of the process, that kind of process, to seek value in delivering mitigation of risk. In understanding how all those complex players that come together to mitigate risk on a project, how you could be a peddler of services more than you are at the minute.
Claire, do you want to say, and then questions?
Yeah, sure, sorry. We don't need to hear from you, but I was just thinking about how you can generate work as opposed to just waiting for clients to ask. And I know that something came up earlier around, but if we generate it and we go to the public sector, they say, oh, we're going to have to procure you, and then you might not get it. And actually, that doesn't have to happen. Provided your client kind of understands procurement properly, there is a way in which if you bring something to them, they are allowed under certain rules around procurement to say this has been brought to us exclusively by X and we're not intending to go out to anybody else. So query your clients on that if that comes up. And the opportunity, I think, it's a very difficult opportunity, but it's there, is there are thousands of small sites around London, and I'm sure you've discussed this ad nauseam in your own offices. Land is being mapped much more forensically now. There's somebody called Johnny Britton that works at somewhere called Land Insight, and I've seen his software, and it literally goes down to garage level, and it enables people to see who owns land, what its planning status is, at a really granular level. London has space for around 150,000 homes on these small sites. Housing associations own them, the MOD owns them, the NHS owns them. Not the big sites, that's just never going to happen, but there are just shed loads of small sites, and if you can come up, if you're prepared to invest in a bit of a scheme and a way in which you're prepared to take a lot of the time risk and so on off your HA or LA, then I think you will be able to take those schemes forward. It's tricky because a lot of public sector clients don't understand how to deal with you on that, but I think there are some that do, and that those are opportunities where you can initiate.
Okay, hands. Anybody got questions? If you could just wait for the mic. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, the Airbnb model is based on a kind of an idea of think it's called disintermediation, where you're sort of bypassing the middleman, basically. I was just wondering, in the supply of buildings for long-term users, what's the equivalent model for that supply of building spaces, and who gets cut out in that, if there is such a model?
John?
Can I answer that one? Because I
Yeah.
was very struck, as others have gone through, that actually I think we're talking about two different models. We're all drawing the one that takes it up to the building being finished, and then we're talking about the value that comes out of the building afterwards, whether it's 150 years later with a phone call, or whether it's in terms of when it's in use and the value within there. And I don't think I have a great answer to this, other than it's something I think the more we understand, the better we'll all be at doing it, is understanding that if you are going to look at a site and try and come up with a way that deals with risk to make Martyn happy, that adds value, that deals with something like that, you've got to think back then through the models to see how you can then secure work through that. What would your role be? Because, you know, if you are a small architect, and I think there's a lot of small architects in the room, and you have a grand idea, you're going to be very unlikely to be able to deliver it. So you've got to think through how you would fit into one of these, if you like, pre-completion models, but still lever some value out of the long-term value within the actual overall project. And I think all of this goes back historically to something called the institutional lease, which has only existed, I think, since post-war years. Martyn will probably know more than I do. But that is how value is created in a conventional development sense, that then allows people to borrow to then carry work out. And if you don't understand the institutional lease, it's something I'd urge you to go away and think about and understand, because it kind of informs everything that we've been looking at today, I think.
Did you want to?
Yeah, can I just add? So we're on. No. I think that's an extremely valid point, because exactly what we're trying to establish as a global group, BAM, is trying to answer that question. It's that what's the Uber version of our industry? And I think earlier in the year, the World Economic Forum talked about, in 5 years' time, 50% of construction jobs won't exist. They also talked about 65% of children going into primary school will go into jobs that don't exist at the moment also. I think we're on the verge of a precipice, literally, of we've got to move on and understand where our industry is going. I think interesting, it's 5% chance of architects going out of business because they still need them. So contractors probably have less with artificial intelligence or whatever. But we haven't got the solution yet, because it's a very difficult one. Because is it people bringing people in and sort of onto a site? Is it a solutions model? It's whatever. But I think you're right. Just on Great Portland Estates, talked to us about an iTunes moment of actually going to digital onto facilities management and having information there. And they talk about iTunes going from CD to iTunes. It jumped, and I think we're on that edge of something is about to happen. And I think we all need to be on that. Otherwise, we'll be the Kodaks of this world, or if we're not careful.
Okay. Yes, hello. If you can wait for the mic, it's just behind you.
Question for Claire. When you talk about there being mechanisms by which councils can have a direct relationship with you if you come to them with an idea, I'm just interested to know what you mean, because I think probably all of us have examples of going to councils and saying, we want a direct route, can we register this piece of land as a community asset, or under the new National Planning Policy Framework for providing land for self-build or whatever, that people are aware of these different mechanisms, not quite sure how to persuade the council that they can use them. And you phone someone at the council, talk to someone in planning department or asset management, and they give you a blank answer. So we don't know, it's really new, or either they don't know or they're being pressurised not to use those mechanisms because they need to get best value for sites. So I'm really interested to know what you can do to make it really clear and actually help them, because sometimes they just don't know. So what can we do as architects to hold them by the hand and say, there are these different routes, X, Y, Z?
Yeah, that is really difficult. As I understand it, under the public procurement rules, you can bypass, or not bypass, that's the wrong word, but there are ways in which you can have an exclusive relationship with people on certain issues if you bring them the job, or you've clearly already brought the value or whatever. So how do you solve that? How do you get past the zero tolerance, I haven't got time to deal with you, so I'm just going to say no, which is very common, and it's totally understandable because local authority cuts and they just haven't got the time or the expert personnel sort of right there. I would think most authorities have a procurement expert, or they have a lawyer advising them. Quite how you get to that body that then sort of is able to trickle down a different message is another matter. I think you have to sort of be able to get to senior people and say, do you realise, sell them a much bigger picture. There is all of these tiny pieces of land, or there are all of these opportunities. We've come to you as a full team that can actually take all that risk away from you and not waste your time on it. We'll get on with this in the background, and by the way, the return to you will be 10 million after 10 years because we'll have created that value for you. I mean, that's quite difficult when you're a small entity, and but you have to tell, I think, a much bigger story that then enables them to see what they're going to get back. Do you want
Sometimes it's worth going to elected members rather than officers, because they will have a much clearer interest in the success of a place, because that's their job. There are local authorities where there are very good relationships between elected members and the officers in regeneration terms, particularly if the cabinet member for regeneration, if you're very lucky that the cabinet member for regeneration is the ward councillor for that place, and that's the best place to go. But sometimes an elected member is often easier to get to than a door slamming officer who, as Claire says, just has too much to do, too busy, hasn't got time to think about it.
A story I tried to tell at Peabody when we looked at a whole load of tiny sites, and there was an architect that came to us and said, I've seen 6 of your sites, and here's 6 schemes, absolutely amazing. But nobody had time to deal with it. So I went to one of our executive directors and said, we could make 5 million for our community development programme if we just let these people get on with this. What do you think? And that message was just more powerful than, there's a funny little site there, can I waste a year on it?
Okay, I've been told that we have to wrap up. Has anybody got a burning question? We can have one question. Burning question. Yes, burning question in the back there.
Hello, Ian McChesney. I'm going to make a bit of a statement which might put a cat amongst the pigeons, but
great news.
I think my feeling is that you've got a project manager, a property developer, Peabody, and a contractor on the stage. But in this room, we're all small practices, really. And I think what is screamingly obvious to me, being based in a we operate in South London in a wealthy suburb. And I think if we all know what the news is going on in America at the moment, is the world is changing so profoundly that perhaps we don't actually appreciate it. And the money is moved from the poor to the rich in a massive way. And where I'm based, there are huge projects taking place. 1 million people are knocking down whole £2 or £3 million houses and building major £6 million houses and hiring architects to do that without a project manager. And what the architects are finding actually is that they are getting paid for what they do, and it's a sort of new, almost a niche, but it's a fundamental and very large sector of work, and a new way that architects need to understand the world. I mean, I think we all want to be socially aware. We all want to be working for the local authorities and the Peabodys. But if we're solvent as practices, we can do that as well. But my feeling is that is that where the new business models are is in an understanding this new economic climate that we're involved with, which I'm afraid may not involve project managers or the BAMs, because we're working with clever local contractors who really know what they're doing, delivering projects for these types of people. So I think practice going forward is about understanding the economics of the modern world that we're discovering.
Yeah, I think thank you for, no, that's good. I think that sort of brings us on to the next section of the day rather well, but does anybody want to respond to that at all, or do we? Cool. That's it, you've had your chance. Because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to hear from 9 different architects, some just starting out, some a little bit more established, who have tried to look at the economic environment that we are sitting within at the moment and think about, okay, standard architectural consultancy model isn't necessarily working as well as it could, so what other ways can we find for in order to practice? And some of those are perhaps radical and controversial. So I'd like to thank the panel, and then we will move on and address your question with the rest of the day. Is that all right? Okay, thanks, guys.